The night was silent on the wide Texas plains, broken only by the low whistle of the wind and the creak of the ranch's old wooden porch. Inside, James Walker sat alone with his thoughts, a half-empty cup of coffee in his hands and the faint laughter of his son echoing in his memory. For years, he had lived like this, quiet, withdrawn, and unwilling to let the world in. Once a decorated soldier himself, now he was just a single father raising his boy the best way he knew how. But loneliness had a way of digging into his chest, reminding him of everything he'd lost and everything he was afraid to reach for again. He thought life would remain like this, simple, quiet, and isolated, until the night the knock on his door shattered the silence. When he opened the door, he expected a ranch hand or maybe a lost traveler, but instead, 11 women stood in the cold, their uniforms torn and dirty from travel. They were soldiers, their eyes sharp but tired, carrying the weight of battles fought both outside and inside themselves. James froze, unsure if he was dreaming or reliving some memory from deployment, but the trembling lips of the youngest soldier snapped him to reality. "Sir," she whispered, "we need shelter." He looked at them, mud-stained boots, scraped knuckles, exhaustion etched deep, and something inside his chest stirred. For years, his ranch had only been big enough for two hearts, his and his boys, but now the universe was asking if it could hold more. The decision was instant, though his mind argued against it. He stepped aside, opening his door wide to strangers whose eyes spoke louder than words. His son, Luke, peeked from behind him, his 10-year-old face filled with curiosity and a touch of fear. James crouched down, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're friends," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true yet. The women filed in, setting down their packs, stretching sore muscles, and exchanging quiet glances that told of hardship endured together. The warmth of the ranch wrapped around them like a blanket, and James realized just how cold the world outside must have been for them to look at his modest home as a sanctuary. That first night was uneasy. James slept lightly, ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards as the soldiers settled into the spare rooms in the living room. His mind replayed questions over and over. Who were they running from? What had happened to their unit? Why had fate pushed them onto his porch? But when he checked on them in the dim light of dawn, what he saw stripped away his doubts. Curled on couches and rugs, boots still on, weapons within reach, they looked less like warriors and more like weary sisters who had carried each other through fire. Something about that image made James's chest tighten. It reminded him of the bond he'd once had with his brothers in arms. As days passed, the ranch shifted from silence to life. The women insisted on helping with chores, mending fences, hauling hay, even cooking meals that brought back smells James hadn't breathed in years. Luke, shy at first, quickly found himself at the center of their attention. They taught him card games, showed him how to braid rope, and even cheered as he rode his pony across the pasture. His laughter filled the house again, and James noticed how it changed the air, how it loosened something locked deep inside him. For so long, the ranch had been haunted by absence. Now, it echoed with footsteps, laughter, and voices that carried both strength and vulnerability. Still, questions lingered, and James needed answers. One evening, while the sunset painted the sky in burning hues, he sat with the eldest among them, Captain Ramirez. Her posture was straight, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Beyond physical weariness, she told him their story, how their transport was attacked, how they were left stranded miles from base, and how leadership had failed to send rescue. "We survived because we stayed together," she said, her voice steady. "But we can't keep running forever." James listened, his heart torn between admiration and worry. These women were not just guests, they were survivors holding themselves together by sheer will. James felt the pull of his old instincts, the soldier in him who never turned away from a fight. But he also knew he had Luke to protect, a boy who had already lost his mother and couldn't lose his father to another battle. Torn between duty to his blood and the call of compassion, James paced the ranch that night under the stars, wrestling with the choice. Yet, when he looked back at the farmhouse, where the glow of lantern lights spilled out onto the fields and laughter drifted faintly through the walls, he realized the decision had already been made. They were family now, even if they hadn't asked to be. Challenges soon came, as they always do when broken souls find refuge together. Supplies ran low, and arguments sparked in the kitchen over food portions. One soldier carried anger like a blade, snapping at James for decisions he made about the ranch. Another fell into silence, retreating into herself until Luke knocked on her door with a drawing of her holding a sword, reminding her she was still strong. James, once used to silence and solitude, found himself learning patience, listening instead of shutting down, and discovering that leadership at home was harder than leadership on the battlefield. It was a test he hadn't expected, but one he was willing to take. The turning point came during a stormy night. Rain battered the ranch, wind howled through the trees, and fear clawed at old scars. Thunder sent one of the younger soldiers into a spiral, her hands clamping over her ears, her eyes wide with remembered trauma. Without hesitation, James knelt beside her, wrapping her in his arms, whispering words he used to calm Luke in his nightmares. "You're safe here. You're not alone." The room fell silent except for the storm, and the women watched as the hardened rancher showed a tenderness few had seen before. It was then they realized the house wasn't just shelter, it was healing. Over time, James grew closer to them, each one carrying her own story, her own wound. They taught him as much as he taught them. One soldier showed him how to repair a rifle he hadn't touched in years, another laughed with him about the awkwardness of raising a boy alone, and another sat with him in silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but full of unspoken understanding. Slowly, the walls James had built around himself crumbled, brick by brick. He hadn't known he was starving for connection until the flood of it filled his days. But the world outside didn't stay quiet forever. One afternoon, a military vehicle rolled up the dusty drive, and uniformed men stepped out with stern faces. They had come for the women, citing orders, protocols, and consequences. James stood firm at the porch, his son at his side and the women behind him. "They're not just soldiers," he said, his voice steady, "they're people. They're family now." The standoff stretched tense and brittle, but James didn't back down, and neither did the women. In the end, the officers left, unwilling to drag out a fight they hadn't expected. For the first time in years, James felt the fire of purpose burn in his chest again. Life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm after that. The women knew their time there was temporary, but every day felt like stolen treasure, mornings of shared coffee, afternoons of hard work, and evenings filled with stories under the stars. Luke grew stronger, braver, more compassionate, shaped not just by his father but by 11 fierce role models who had faced the world's cruelty and refused to bow. James often watched his son laugh with them and thought how blessed he was, not only to have survived his own battles but to witness a new family forming before his eyes. When the time finally came for the women to leave, the ranch was filled with silence heavier than any storm. They hugged Luke tight, promising to write, and clasped James's hand with gratitude that words could not contain. Captain Ramirez looked him in the eye, her voice breaking as she said, "You gave us more than shelter. You gave us back our humanity." James swallowed the lump in his throat, fighting to hold himself steady. He knew letting go was the hardest part of loving, but it was also proof that love had taken root. The ranch returned to quiet, but it was no longer the hollow silence it once was. James and Luke carried their memories like treasures, their laughter echoing in corners that had once known only loss. Every now and then, letters arrived, scribbled with tales from faraway lands, folded with pressed flowers or sketches. Each letter was a reminder that though distance separated them, they were bound by something unbreakable. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James found himself standing on the porch, remembering the night his life changed forever. He often thought of that knock on the door, the sound that cracked open years of isolation and poured in a tide of hope. For so long, he had believed his story was one of endings, of living quietly until time faded him away. But now he knew better. His life wasn't just about survival, it was about connection, courage, and opening his heart to people who needed it as much as he did. The women had arrived broken, seeking refuge, but in sheltering them, James had unknowingly rebuilt himself. Luke grew taller with each passing year, his shoulders straight like his father's but his heart softer, molded by the love of the women who had taught him compassion. Sometimes, when he rode out into the fields, he imagined them there beside him, cheering, guiding, reminding him that strength comes in many forms. James would watch his boy and smile, knowing that what had begun as an accident of fate had become the cornerstone of their lives. The ranch was no longer a place of solitude, but a legacy of resilience and family. And so the story of James Walker, the solitary father, became something greater. He was no longer just the man who lived alone on a ranch with his son. He was the man who opened his door when the world came knocking, the man who found family in strangers, and the man who discovered that healing was never meant to be done alone. His house, once a hollow reminder of loss, was now sacred ground where hearts had mended and futures had been written anew. In the end, James realized that strength wasn't about how much weight you could carry on your shoulders, it was about how much room you could make in your heart. His life had been reshaped by 11 soldiers who walked into his world carrying their scars and left carrying his love. And though they were gone, their presence lingered in the laughter of his son, the warmth of his home, and the quiet promise that he would never face the world alone again. The ranch still stands tall against the Texas horizon, its fences strong, its fields wide, its porch welcoming. And if you walk past it at sunset, you might hear the echo of voices, women's laughter, a boy's cheer, and a man's steady words weaving them all together. For the story of the single dad who lived alone ended not in loneliness, but in the embrace of an unlikely family that came knocking one night and changed everything forever.